cord. So this is an enormous diversity of protists, mostly unicellular organisms that are now divided into, 20 or more kingdoms under the domain of eukarya or eukaryotes. So we studied a few of these in the lab. This one is it symmetric or asymmetric, would you say? So you can answer in the chat or
asymmetric.
Unmute. Asymmetric, yeah. So it's asymmetric. Yeah, good. Yeah. So symmetry is something that helps to identify organisms, and there's reasons why there are different symmetries. So the amoeba is asymmetric because it forms pseudopods in order to engulf food. Good. So from the lab, let's see, what else do we have here that we saw? This one, bottom right. Do you recognize that one? We didn't see this exact one in the lab, so you probably wouldn't recognize it as such, but it is the same as this one up here in the same group, and it's a diatom. Yeah. Are there any other amoeba on this slide?
In the middle?
Yes. So this is an amoeba, and this is an amoeba. So they don't have any particular symmetry.
What about the one to the left of the diatom? The green one?
Here?
I can't see.
This one right here?
Yeah, that one.
That is, I'm not sure actually. I think that is a dinoflagellate though. Yeah. I believe it's a dinoflagellate. And one of the reasons I think that is because it's green. So it's not stained, but it's green, so it makes me think that it photosynthesizes, whereas the amoeba is an engulfer. And the groups in which protists are placed depend on their DNA these days, their sequences of DNA, but there's other ways of grouping protists. So some of them are plant-like, they photosynthesize. Some of them are animal-like, they're heterotrophic. And some of them are saprobes, like fungi, and they absorb and decompose material in their environment. So today I want to talk a little bit about protists and where they came from, their nutritional strategies, taxonomy, diversity, and ecological categories. So this is a geologic time scale looking at the various eons. So before protists, there was an eon known as the Archean eon, and that was before 2.5 billion years ago. So the first prokaryotes, evidence of them are from about 3,800 years, or 3.8 billion years ago. And those are archaea, so they lived in a non-conducive environment to aerobes. Archaeans are largely anaerobic. They don't require oxygen. But once oxygen is produced and the atmosphere became more oxygen rich, then it wasn't until then when we see more protists in the fossil records. So they are the first eukaryotes occurring in the Proterozoic eon. How many species are there? There's about 100,000 species or so of protists as far as we know. There's been I'm going to change that to black. I think it's 3 million species are described. That means that they've been discovered and that they've been given characteristics, or they have characteristics that distinguish them from all other species. So there's usually have to collect many samples of the same species in order to determine that. So this is an example of which groups have different numbers of species. So here our protozoans are here at about 100,000 or so. And look, this is the crazy species distribution of insects. Yeah. And of those, beetles are the most numerous species of anything on the planet. Beetles are enormously species rich. It's thought that there's probably, I think the latest estimate, I just looked it up, it looks like it might be 8.5 million species on the planet, something like that. They haven't all been discovered because some of them are remarkably difficult to discover. So, like for example, I was in Costa Rica doing that when I was doing that study on the frogs, and there were researchers there researching ants, and they were looking into 3 trees only, 3 species of trees that always grow together. And so in order to collect the ants, they put these great huge funnels underneath the trees. Great big funnels with at the bottom would be a jar with alcohol. And they placed the funnel so they were all around the trees. And then someone would go up and insecticide the trees, and everything that was in it would fall out. And while we were there, which was I think 18 days, they discovered 200 species of ants that are just in these 3 trees in the tropics. So there's a lot of discovery to be done still in the tropics. So where did they come from in the first place? How could eukaryotes ever arise out of prokaryotes? So one major difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes is that eukaryotes have membrane-enclosed organelles. So eukaryotes have a nucleus plus membrane-enclosed organelles. There's a theory as to how they may have arisen, which is called the endosymbiont theory. So say you have an ancestral prokaryote, and the plasma membrane folds inward like so, which could help this particular prokaryote to engulf food. And by engulfing the food, it gets easier for the prokaryote to digest it with its own enzymes. And so this infolding may have led to a membrane in which the DNA was trapped, essentially, but was also separated from the enzymes that digest everything in the cell. So the DNA is safer inside the nuclear envelope. So that would be in the very beginning. To make different kinds of eukaryote cells with different organelles, one event may have been the engulfing of some kind of heterotrophic aerobic prokaryote, which eventually, just like a colony, just stayed with the cell and they reproduced together because they worked together so well with the aerobic heterotrophic prokaryote producing energy. There may also have been the engulfing of a photosynthetic prokaryote in other cases. So this prokaryote had plastids with chlorophyll. So what's interesting about that is that nowadays modern cells, the eukaryote cells of today, have mitochondria. And so all cells have mitochondria that produce energy. The plant cells have plastids that are also known as chloroplasts, organelles that photosynthesize. And what is really sort of a powerful kind of evidence that this may have been the case is that it turns out that mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own DNA. Circular DNA, which is how some of the prokaryote DNA exists. They're called plasmids. So it's a good theory. Here's another diagram to show that, but it's thought that there may have been not only one event of endosymbiosis, but more events of endosymbiosis. So this first event might have led to cells that are similar to red algae and green algae cells of today, and they themselves were engulfed as a secondary endosymbiosis. Yeah, and so the characteristics of the alveolates, for example, have that plastid with the certain types of pigments that this initial red algae cell had. That includes your dinoflagellates, your apicomplexans, your ciliates, and your stromatophiles. And the euglenids and the I can't pronounce that, the green algae may have arisen this way by engulfing a green algae protocell, basically. So it's a very interesting hypothesis. I don't think anyone's come up with a better one. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is how eukaryotes came about in the first place. So phylogeny divides eukaryotes into loads of clades. So, nope. I thought I could blow that up, but I don't think I can. So these clades, what a clade is a number of different species that have the same ancestor. So this is an ancestral eukaryote way back here. And it branched off, and over many, many millions of years gave rise to the groups that we see today. So these are the stromatophiles, for example, the amoebas. And over here we have the fungi, the animalia, the chlorophyta, the plantae. And these are all descendants of an original eukaryote that branched off and diverged into many different forms. So protists are so diverse that few general characteristics can be cited without exceptions. You know, before protists were just given a kingdom, they were a kingdom. And when anybody didn't know quite what kingdom something belonged to, they just threw them in the protists. So for a while there, the protists were just this like mixed bag of stuff that nobody really knew where to put them. Yeah. 600,000 now, there's more than that as far as I know, it's up to 100,000. Known protists are unicellular, but some are colonial and some are multicellular. So this is the Volvox. I still think of the Volvox as colonial because that's how I grew up, but you know what? Nowadays, people are suggesting they're multicellular. These bits inside are daughter colonies of cells that will branch off, and they're held together by a gelatinous material that the cells extrude. And what would the advantage be of being in this round colony for a photosynthesizer? So think about that for a sec. What is the advantage? where do photosynthesizers in an aquatic environment get light?
So from the
So
surface,
from the
like,
surface, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so there's a zone called the photic zone in any body of water, and that's how far light penetrates. And that's where these organisms have to live in order to get light. So it gives them some buoyancy and a way of moving with currents so that they're close to the surface. Oh, watch me not be able to spell it, buoyancy and movement with currents.
Can you repeat the name of the zone? Well, the
The
zone
photic
where
zone. Yeah.
photic zone. Thank you.
The photic zone. Yeah, where light penetrates. Yeah. And these are multicellular algae. So there's three kinds of multicellular algae that you might know as seaweeds. Those are your brown, red, and green seaweeds. So they are very complex. They're much more complex than prokaryotes in that they have membrane-enclosed organelles that perform a lot of functions and eventually did allow the eukaryotes to form multicellular organisms. But a single cell, a unicellular eukaryote, has to perform all the basic functions that are performed by the collective of specialized cells in plants and animals. So when cells form colonies, some cells in that colony start to specialize, and eventually they depend on each other for their specializations. They're very nutritionally diverse. Some are aerobic, they require oxygen. Some are photoautotrophs. They get energy from the sun and they make their own food, sugar. They're heterotrophs. They get food from outside themselves, like the amoeba that engulfs a paramecium. And they may be both, like the euglena. So the euglenas we looked at in class. I won't look at the individuals too closely, but they are mixotrophs. Yeah, in that they do photosynthesize and they engulf food. So some of the features though are quite interesting. So they have movement via flagellum. They have an eye spot. Why would it be useful for euglena to have an eye spot? What is the eye spot detecting?
The movement of their prey?
Yes, it could detect movement of prey by detecting their shadow. Exactly. So yeah, it detects light or the absence of light. Contractile vacuoles are such that they, the contractile vacuole, I think in this case, function is to expel water. I think a lot of organisms take up water if their electrolytes are imbalanced to the environment. There are chloroplasts. So the chloroplasts, they perform the photosynthesis. The euglenids. So there's three sort of ecological categories in which protists belong. And this is a different way of looking at protists because in some cases we're just interested in how they live and where they live. But what's also very interesting is that this is likely where animals evolved from. Animal-like protists, fungi, probably evolved from fungus-like protists, and plant-like protists would have given rise to plants. So before there were multicellular organisms, there were eukaryotes, protists, unicellular protists. They're found almost anywhere there's water. They need water because of their plasma membrane, and they diffuse nutrients and waste directly into water. They also diffuse carbon dioxide and oxygen directly into water. So they're found anywhere there's water: oceans, ponds, lakes, soil, leaf litter. In aquatic habitats, some protists may be benthic. Benthic means living on the bottom, so living in mud. Phytoplankton, so the word phyto means plant. Plankton means swimming. So they include eukaryotic algae and prokaryotic cyanobacteria. And those are the basis of most marine and freshwater food chains. So that is the bottom of the food chain. That's how everything else is surviving in our oceans and our lakes and rivers. So the prokaryote to the cyanobacteria is a prokaryote, but it's very abundant. Some protists are symbionts. They inhabit body fluids, tissues, or cells of hosts. They may be mutualistic, or they may be parasitism. So I'll give you a few examples. So this one is Giardia intestinalis. It's a diplomad, and it's very unpleasant because it causes diarrhea and digestive issues. It's found in rivers and creeks, particularly where there have been feces of things like beavers. So some people call it beaver fever. Yeah, so it's an intestinal parasite. Trypanosoma, that causes sleeping sickness. That is a protist you find has a relationship, not a relationship, it has a life cycle that involves both the tsetse fly, whoops, sorry, darn it. I think I'd be better at this by now. It involves both the tsetse fly and a mammal. Yeah. So in humans, the area in which you find sleeping sickness is mid-Africa. It's very common there. There's another kind, Trypanosoma cruzi, that causes Chagas disease. And it's thought that Darwin might have had Chagas because when he went back to England, he was sick a few times, and it seemed to be a heart issue. And that is indeed what this particular Trypanosoma causes, Chagas disease. So in this case, the protist requires a bug. This is a puruvid bug, also known as the assassin bug, and a human or other mammal, or even chickens, I think, or maybe chickens are just vectors. But I remember when I was in, I worked in Bolivia for a summer, and we were all very scared of this bug because it would live in the thatched roofs of people's homes and crawl out at night and get a blood meal. So blood meals are required in order for these organisms to breed. And as such, they deposit the protist into the blood of a human or other mammal. So of course you have to have mosquito netting around you at night, no matter where you're sleeping, really. Yeah. I thought that 25% of the population in some areas, though I'm not actually completely sure of that number, but it's a fairly high number of people that have the Chagas. So this diagram shows a life cycle. So I won't go through it in detail, but I will ask you in the future. This might be, for example, exam alert. A question on a quiz might be something like, what is the life cycle of a particular parasite? So you could use this one as your example. Or you could use the one that causes malaria. So, if you ask people, just like on the street, do you know what a protist is? Most people don't know what a protist is. I've never heard of them before, and just kind of assume, I guess, that most diseases are caused by bacteria or viruses, but there are quite a few protist-caused diseases. So this one is the Plasmodium, and it has an intricate life cycle between a mosquito and a human. So this is a good diagram showing that. Yeah, see, every time I do that, I wreck it. Oops. So, I'm not sure why. I think I have to put the pencil down first and then my palm or something. Anyhow, I think I'll need to practice this a little bit so that I don't keep changing screens on you. But I welcome you to look at the life cycle of the Plasmodium. It has to exist in two places, the mosquito and a mammal. So malaria is very widespread. And if you do look at this one as your particular parasite of interest, then you should look at all the steps of the life cycle. So in some cases, living in the human, they have, I think they're called merozoites, that multiply in the blood cells, and then they burst and they go and infect other blood cells. So it causes a lot of difficulties in breathing and fatigue and all that. So there's the female Anopheles mosquito. It bites a human and it injects the Plasmodium spores that are in the mosquito saliva into the human bloodstream. They invade red blood cells and they feed on hemoglobin. They cause the cells to burst. Some of the merozoites develop into male and female gametocytes, and they're ingested by the mosquito when the mosquito takes another blood meal from human. Yeah, so that's another life cycle of a parasite. Malaria is quite a widespread disease, and indeed, it's shown up in Australia and Papua New Guinea, and I'm not sure where else, but it seems to be getting more prevalent in places other than in Africa.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes, please.
What's the difference between a parasite and a pathogen?
The difference between a parasite and a pathogen. A pathogen, that's a good question. What is the difference between a parasite and a pathogen? So pathology, a pathogen is something that causes disease. And a parasite is a living organism that feeds off of a host. Yeah, so I don't think a pathogen has to be a living disease-causing organism or substance. Yes.
Okay, makes sense.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Dinoflagellates are super abundant in the ocean. They have some incredibly lovely shapes. They have very characteristic shape. And one thing that distinguishes dinoflagellates is they have internal plates of cellulose. And they have two flagellae. They sit in perpendicular grooves, and they produce a kind of spinning movement. So you can see the flagellae there and the plates. These are the plates. There is a kind of an algae bloom in ocean environments caused by a population growth, a very fast population growth of dinoflagellates. These are called red tides. They're kind of reddish brown or kind of pinkish orange because of the pigments in the plastids of the dinoflagellate. And unfortunately, they also produce toxins. So that causes paralytic shellfish poisoning because those those toxins are taken up by filter feeders. A lot of the invertebrates in the intertidal and the ones that we harvest are filter feeders, so they get concentrated in some invertebrates, and it can cause fish kills as well. There are some places they occur more readily, and sometimes that's areas of coastal habitat where there might be an influx of fertilizer from farms, for example. So that's what it looks like from the sky. That's a really prevalent, like a large red tide. Some dinoflagellates are mutualistic with other organisms. So in this case, we're looking at the coral here. This is all coral. And coral has a mutualistic arrangement with dinoflagellates called zooxanthellae. And the zooxanthellae are dinoflagellates that live in the coral. The coral needs the dinoflagellates to photosynthesize and provide sugar to the coral. The coral then creates a calcium carbonate substrate on which it grows. So there is a phenomenon at the moment known as coral bleaching, which is occurring a lot of coral reefs. The exact reason is not known. It could be that the ocean is warming in some places. It could be an influx of fresh water, and there may be other reasons. But what happens is the dinoflagellates, they just take off. They just leave from the corals. And then the corals are left without dinoflagellates, and eventually they die. So it's fairly serious. Some dinoflagellates are bioluminescent. So the purpose of bioluminescence for the dinoflagellates is to bioluminesce all at once so that they dissuade predators. Yeah. So it works with a protein called luciferin and an enzyme called luciferase. And the luciferin is oxidized, and the byproduct is light. So yeah, documentary on Netflix, Chasing Coral. That would be an interesting one to watch. So do they talk about the coral bleaching in that one, Eduardo?
I'm sorry, say again?
Do they talk about coral bleaching in the Chasing Coral?
Yeah, it's specifically on coral bleaching. They go to Australia, they do some studies, and it's pretty awesome.
Interesting. That would be a good one to watch. Diatoms, they have unique glass-like walls composed of hydrated silica, and that's embedded in their organic matrix. They have lots of really beautiful shapes. Foraminiferans, they're almost all marine, and they have also, if you look at them closely, did you get to see foraminiferans in the lab? No, we might not have had samples. They are an incredibly common fossil in marine environments. So their shells, their calcareous shells, end up, after the cliffs have eroded away, that's all ocean floor. This is all ocean floor. And the white are all the shells of foraminiferans. They're called the White Cliffs of Dover. Radiolarians have pseudopods, and the pseudopods of the radiolarians, these that are sticking out like that, they absorb food at the end, and then they make, so this is a piece of food, and then they make the pseudopod shorter and shorter, so it brings the food into the middle of the cell body. Radiolarians also have like some amazing shapes and sizes. I don't think we looked at macroalgae, like I collected some macroalgae and put it in the lab, but I don't think we ended up looking at it, so we'll have to do that in the future. There's Phaeophyta is the brown algae. This is multicellular. The algae that you see there is very common. Here it's called fucus or rockweed, and it's a brown algae. They're collectively known as seaweeds, and they're the only multicellular protists, are the seaweeds, the large algae. They have to inhabit intertidal and subtidal zones because they require light. They're all photosynthetic. They might live in fairly harsh environments. The intertidal can be very exposed to waves, for example. So a seaweed anatomy is such that the whole thing is called a frond. They always have a hold fast because they can't float away from the photosynthetic zone or the photozone. Often they have a gas bladder, and that helps them to float, and the blade, which is very thin, and so it helps to absorb sunlight, being so thin. The stipe is the stalk in between the holdfast and the blades. So that's just some seaweed anatomy. Some brown algae have floats, like really large gas bladders, and they raise the blades toward the surface. Some kelps, they form these huge underwater forests that are very similar to forests where you see different organisms at different heights. They might even be 60 meters long. So this is looking up in a kelp forest. So they have biochemical adaptations for intertidal and subtidal conditions. Cell walls, for example, they're composed of cellulose and gel-forming polysaccharides, so they cushion the thalli, so those are the blades, against the agitation of waves. Many seaweeds are eaten by coastal people. Laminaria is kombu in Japan, and porphyra is nori, so that's red algae that's used for sushi wraps. They're also useful for a lot of substances, gel-forming substances that are extracted for commercial operations. They're thickeners in food, lubricants in oil drilling, and they're culture media and microbiology. So there's some nori just to make you hungry for dinner. Carrageenan is the product that for toothpaste and chocolate milk and different types of products, it allows them to be thickened, but also it allows, for example, in the chocolate milk, the chocolate to stay suspended in the milk as opposed to precipitating out. And this is, of course, the agar that we saw in our Petri dishes. They have pretty complex life cycles, the brown, red, and green algae, similar to the alternation of generations that are seen by plants. So, for example, they're multicellular in two stages as sporophytes and gametophytes. So this is a term largely used for plants, but they use them for algae as well, macroalgae. So a sporophyte is 2N or diploid. That means it has a full complement of DNA. Then sporangia form, and the cells go through meiosis and form zoospores. Some of those zoospores grow to be female gametophytes, in other words, multicellular organisms, but they're haploid, and male. They're also haploid. And they collectively, the males produce sperm that swim through the water toward females that have produced eggs, and fertilization occurs and they form a zygote, which is 2N, that develops into the adult. It's called an alternation of generations because there's a multicellular aspect to the diploid stage and the gametophyte stage. Sorry, that's just some pictures of red algae, filamentous red algae and blade red algae. Chlorophyta, that is the green algae that includes, what did you see already? Spirogyra, Chlamydomonas, and in this case, ulva, also known as sea lettuce. It's very common around here. It's easy to see the adaptation of sea lettuce. The blades are really, really thin, just a couple of cells thick, and to collect sunlight, lots of sunlight for growth. Chlamydomonas nivalis, that's a green algae, interestingly, but it looks red, and it lives in snow and glaciers. Another type of green algae lives as a symbiont in anemones. So an anemone is also an cnidarian, just like corals, and they have these symbiotic algae that live inside them. Some algae exist in symbiosis with fungi. So this is known as a lichen. It grows on trees, it grows everywhere. It is a fungi and algae that have taken a liking to each other. So they live together. The algae provides sugar for the fungus, and the fungus provides access to sunlight and also nutrients to the algae. Have you seen lichens before on your travels? Yeah. The thing about lichens is that they can grow absolutely anywhere. They are the first kind of organism to grow on bare rocks, like after deglaciation. So green algae have both sexual and asexual reproductive stages. They have gametes that are biflagellate, so that's the swimming stage, and chloroplasts. So in this case, they go through sexual reproduction. In other words, there's meiosis, but they're not called male and female. They're called the minus type and the plus type. And a plus type always gets together with a minus type to form a zygote. Yeah, and in some cases, there's just simply asexual reproduction where they simply divide by fission. Green algae. So they may form colonies. They may be in individual cells. They may even be multinucleate filaments. So in the case of the chloroplasts, they are such long filaments, but each filament is a single cell, so it has multiple nuclei in order to service the whole cell, just like our muscle cells. Our skeletal muscle cells are multinucleate. They're so long, they require many nuclei to service the whole cell. Yeah. And the ova are truly a multicellular kind of organism. The ciliates are pretty diverse. We've seen those in the lab. Your paramecium with the cilia that help them to move around. And these are the stentors, and their cilia help to provide a current, and the current brings food into the stentor. And of course, the amoeba. They're all unicellular, and they use their pseudopodia to move around. They're quite fascinating. So I just went through and I found a bunch of pictures of different kinds of slime mold fruiting bodies. And I thought, well, you know, at the microscopic level, they're absolutely beautiful. They almost look edible, don't they? And that's where I'd like to end the lecture today on protists. Thank you for watching.